My name is Leila, and I was 27 years old when I married Adam, the man I believed would finally give me the calm, loving, and stable life I had always dreamed of. For years, I had imagined what marriage would feel like, the comfort of coming home to someone who truly understood me, the warmth of building a life together, the quiet happiness of knowing I belonged somewhere completely. And when I stood beside Adam on our wedding day, surrounded by flowers, soft music, and the smiling faces of people we loved, I truly believed that dream had finally become real. Everything about that day felt magical, almost too perfect to be true. The lights glowed softly against the evening sky, laughter echoed across the room, and every promise we exchanged felt sacred. But what I didn't know then was that sometimes the most beautiful beginnings hide the deepest storms, and sometimes the chapter that changes your life forever begins not with pain or conflict, but with a smile so calm, so unreadable, that you don't realize until much later just how much it will shape your future. That smile belonged to Nadia, my mother-in-law. She was 58 years old, graceful, elegant, and the kind of woman who never needed to raise her voice to command attention. She carried herself with a quiet confidence that made everyone around her naturally fall into place. And there was something about her presence that always made a room feel smaller, quieter, more careful. At first, I wanted desperately to impress her. I told myself that if I was patient, kind, and respectful enough, she would eventually open her heart to me and accept me not just as Adam's wife, but as part of her family. But the truth was far more complicated than I had expected. Nadia was never openly cruel. She never insulted me, never embarrassed me in front of others, never said anything sharp enough for me to point to and say, "There, that is why I feel uncomfortable." And yet, every time she looked at me, I felt as though she was reading thoughts I had never spoken aloud. Her eyes carried a strange intensity, the kind that made me feel exposed in ways I couldn't explain, as if she could see every insecurity, every fear, every hidden doubt I was trying so hard to keep buried. In the beginning, I tried to dismiss those feelings. I told myself I was simply nervous because I was adjusting to a new family, a new home, a new role in life. After all, wasn't it normal for a woman to feel uncertain in the early days of marriage? Wasn't it normal to feel pressure when trying to fit into a family with years of traditions, memories, and unspoken expectations? But the unease did not fade. If anything, it grew stronger with each passing day. It wasn't one big dramatic event that unsettled me. It was the small things. The way Nadia would silently observe me while I cooked dinner. The way her eyes lingered when I rearranged the living room. The pause before she answered even the simplest question, as if she were measuring my worth before deciding whether I deserved a response. Even the most ordinary moments began to feel heavy with meaning. The way I folded towels, the way I greeted guests, the way I spoke to Adam when he came home tired from work. Everything seemed to exist under her quiet scrutiny. And perhaps the hardest part was that because she said so little, my mind filled the silence with fear, turning every glance into judgment and every pause into silent disapproval. One evening, when the sky was heavy with rain and Adam had called to say he would be working late, I found myself alone in the house with Nadia for the first time in a way that felt impossible to escape. The house was unusually quiet. and the soft tapping of rain against the windows made the silence feel even more intense. I remember trying to steady myself as I made tea, hoping that perhaps the calm atmosphere would finally allow us to connect in a more genuine way. I wanted so badly for there to be warmth between us, some sign that the tension I had been feeling existed only in my imagination. So I sat down with her and tried to start a conversation, asking about Adam as a child, about family traditions, about what life had been like for her when she was younger. She answered politely, but her words felt distant, almost rehearsed, as if she had spent years learning how to speak without ever revealing too much. Then, after a long silence, she slowly turned toward me and asked a question that made the air in the room feel suddenly cold. "Do you really understand what it means to become part of this family?" Her voice was soft, almost gentle, but something about the way she said it sent a chill straight through me. It wasn't just a question. It felt like a warning. For a moment, I couldn't breathe properly. My mind raced for the right answer, but none of the words I wanted to say seemed strong enough. How could I explain that I loved her son deeply, that I was trying my best, that I wanted nothing more than to belong? How could I put into words the quiet fear I carried every day, the fear of failing, the fear of never being enough, the fear of always feeling like an outsider in a place that was supposed to become my home? But before I could answer, Nadia simply looked away, as if she had already learned everything she needed to know from my silence. She turned her gaze toward the rain outside the window, and the conversation ended there, but the weight of her words stayed with me long after that moment had passed. That night, lying awake beside Adam while he slept peacefully, I stared into the darkness and felt something shift inside me. For the first time, I began to wonder if I had stepped into a family whose history ran far deeper and darker than I had ever imagined. The next morning, Nadia called me into the kitchen with a seriousness in her voice that made my stomach tighten instantly. Sunlight filtered softly through the curtains, but the warmth of the morning did nothing to ease the tension building inside me. She was already sitting at the table when I entered, a cup of tea placed neatly in front of the empty chair across from her, as though she had been waiting for this exact moment. Her face was calm, but there was something unmistakably urgent in her expression. When I sat down, she looked directly at me and said, "Leila, there are things you need to understand. About Adam, about this family, and about yourself." The moment those words left her mouth, I felt a knot form in my chest. Something in me knew that whatever she was about to say would alter the way I saw everything from that day forward. Over the next several days, she began sharing stories with me, stories I had never heard Adam mention, stories about sacrifices she had made as a young mother, about hardships the family had endured in silence, about betrayals, disappointments, and burdens that had shaped them all in ways they rarely discussed openly. At first, I listened with polite curiosity, assuming she was simply trying to help me understand where the family came from. But as the stories continued, I began to notice something unsettling. None of them were random. None of them were casual memories shared for comfort or nostalgia. Every story carried a lesson. Every memory contained a warning. Every sentence felt carefully chosen, as if she were not just telling me about the past, but preparing me for something that had not yet happened. The more time I spent with her, the more I realized Nadia was not simply trying to be understood. She was trying to shape me. One afternoon, while we stood side by side in the kitchen chopping vegetables for dinner, she broke the silence in a way that made me stop moving completely. Without looking at me, she said, "Love is beautiful, Leila, but love alone is never enough when life begins to test people." I turned to look at her, but her eyes remained fixed on the cutting board, her hands moving with calm precision, as though she were speaking of something ordinary rather than something that struck straight into the center of my heart. Then she added, "One day, you will have to decide whether you are only Adam's wife, or whether you are strong enough to truly stand beside him when everything begins to fall apart." Her words unsettled me in a way I couldn't explain. Part of me wanted to ask what she meant, to demand clarity, to understand what kind of future she seemed to see so clearly while I remained lost in confusion. But another part of me was afraid of the answer. So instead, I stayed quiet, carrying her words inside me like a shadow I could not escape. A few days later, that shadow became real. It was late at night when my phone rang, and the sound alone was enough to send a wave of dread through my body. I was half asleep when I reached for it, and the moment I heard Sarah, Adam's younger sister, crying on the other end of the line, my heart dropped. Her words came out broken and rushed, almost impossible to understand through her sobs, but the message was clear enough to make my blood run cold. "Leila, something happened. Adam is in serious trouble." In that instant, all the quiet tension, all the strange warnings, all the unsettling lessons Nadia had been giving me suddenly rushed back into my mind with terrifying clarity. My hands started shaking so badly, I nearly dropped the phone. Trouble? What kind of trouble? Was he hurt? Was he safe? Within minutes, the truth began to unfold in fragments, so heavy they felt impossible to carry. Adam had been betrayed by someone he trusted deeply in a business deal that involved not only his career, but a family project that carried years of effort, sacrifice, and emotional investment. Important financial documents had been manipulated, key information had been hidden, and if the damage was not controlled immediately, the consequences could destroy not only Adam's professional future, but the family's name and stability as well. I felt completely frozen. My thoughts became tangled, my breathing uneven, my chest tight with panic. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know where to start. And just as I stood there on the edge of breaking down, Nadia appeared in the doorway. She looked exactly as she always did, calm, composed, almost impossibly steady. But this time, something in her face was different. There was no distance in her eyes now, no silent observation, no unreadable mystery, only focus, only certainty. She looked at me not like someone fragile who needed comfort, but like someone who was being called to rise. "Sit down," she said firmly, though her voice remained controlled. "You don't have time to panic." And somehow, the authority in her tone cut through the chaos in my mind more effectively than any reassurance could have. Over the next several hours, we worked side by side in a way I never could have imagined. Papers covered the kitchen table. Phone calls were made. Emails were sent. Records were reviewed. Mistakes were traced back to their source. Every few minutes, another truth surfaced, another detail fell into place, another layer of betrayal revealed itself. My heart pounded the entire time, and there were moments when I thought I would completely fall apart under the pressure. But Nadia never let me collapse. Every time my hands trembled too much to hold a document steady, she gave me something practical to focus on. Every time my thoughts spiraled into fear, she redirected me toward the next step. Every time I doubted my ability to help, she reminded me, without softness, but with certainty, that fear was a luxury we did not have room for that night. And somewhere between midnight and sunrise, something changed inside me. I stopped seeing myself as the frightened young woman trying desperately not to fail. I stopped seeing Nadia as the distant mother-in-law whose approval I could never earn. Instead, I began to understand the truth I had been too afraid to face before. She had never been trying to break me. She had been trying to strengthen me. Not because she was cold, and not because she wanted control, but because she understood something I had not yet learned, that love means very little if it cannot survive pressure, uncertainty, and crisis. By the time dawn finally arrived, the betrayal had been exposed, the worst of the damage had been contained, and the path toward protecting Adam's future had become clear. I was exhausted in every possible way. But beneath the exhaustion was something else, something steadier, stronger, and more certain than anything I had felt before. When Adam finally came home later that morning, his face pale with stress and sleeplessness, he found me sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by paperwork, cold coffee cups, and the remains of a night that had changed me forever. He stared at me with complete disbelief, his eyes moving from the documents to my face as if he couldn't quite process what he was seeing. "You did all this?" he asked, his voice filled with shock and gratitude. I looked at him for a moment, too emotionally drained to even smile properly. And then I turned my eyes toward Nadia, who stood quietly near the doorway. "No," I said softly. "We did." And in that moment, for the first time since I had entered that family, I saw something in her face I had never seen before. Her expression softened, and her eyes, once so difficult to read, now held something unmistakable: pride. Not the distant pride of someone evaluating from afar, but the quiet pride of someone who had witnessed a transformation and recognized its meaning. Later that morning, when the house had finally grown still and the first warmth of sunlight filled the kitchen, Nadia brought me a fresh cup of tea and sat beside me in silence. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. There was no need. Too much had happened, and somehow words felt too small for all that had changed between us in a single night. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. There was no need. Too much had happened, and somehow words felt too small for all that had changed between us in a single night. I was hard on you because I needed to know whether you could carry the weight of this family when the time came. I looked at her, stunned, because in that one sentence, everything suddenly made sense. The tension, the distance, the quiet lessons, the tests hidden in ordinary moments, the silence that had once made me feel so unwelcome. She had never been trying to destroy me. She had been preparing me, not because she doubted me, but because she knew life would eventually demand strength from me in ways I could not yet imagine. She reached for my hand and held it gently, and with a softness I had never heard from her before, she said, "And now I know." I felt tears rise instantly, not only because of what she said, but because of what it meant. For weeks, I had feared her, resented her, misunderstood her. I had mistaken her strength for coldness, her silence for judgment, her distance for rejection. But now I saw her clearly. She was not simply the difficult mother-in-law I had been trying to survive. She was a woman shaped by hardship, discipline, sacrifice, and love expressed in ways that were not always easy to recognize. She had seen my fear long before I admitted it to myself, and instead of comforting me with softness alone, she had chosen to prepare me for the reality of life. In that moment, I stopped seeing her as someone standing between me and happiness. I began to see her as someone who had quietly, painfully, and powerfully helped me become the woman I needed to be. From that day forward, everything between us changed. The tension that had once filled every room slowly dissolved into something warmer, deeper, and far more meaningful than simple approval. We were no longer two women cautiously trying to understand each other from opposite sides of silence. We had become something far more complicated and far more beautiful, two people connected not by obligation, but by truth, resilience, and a shared understanding of what it means to protect the people you love. And as I looked around at my family in the days that followed, listening to their laughter, watching the house return to life, I realized something I had never truly understood before. Family is not built only through easy moments, smiles, celebrations, or blood. Sometimes, family is built in the middle of fear, in sleepless nights, in difficult truths, in the moments when everything seems ready to collapse, and yet someone chooses to stand beside you anyway. And perhaps the greatest lesson of all was this. Sometimes, the person who intimidates you the most, the person you fear, misunderstand, or struggle to accept, may quietly become the very person who changes your life forever. And that is exactly what my mother-in-law did to mine. Before you go, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss any new content.